I am excited to be here this morning and to continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. Jeff has done an amazing job taking us through a very difficult book in a lot of ways, mostly because it's just so doggone depressing. When you hear the heart of Solomon pouring out some of his life and some of the things that he was struck by during his kingship over Israel. So we're going to take a look at chapter 10. I always get amazed when Jeff has some of us speak on Sundays, and we walk through the book of Ecclesiastes. I think Dennis did one Sunday, and I'm doing 10 today. It's interesting that Jeff gets to choose the passages that he wants versus the ones he wants us to do. Let me give you an example. Last week, if you remember, he got to speak on chapter 9, and it dealt with wives, food, and clothes. He assigns me chapter 10, and we deal with flies, snakes, and horses. I'm not sure that's quite fair. Besides the fact I hate snakes. And to have to talk about them is not really a comfort to me. There was a moment, most of you know Richard Winson, former pastor of the church, especially when it was over in Collinsville. He was here a few weeks ago for a funeral, and it was good to see Richard. I don't get a chance to converse with him a lot. But we were talking, and he had, of all things to talk about, had to remind me of the time that I had a snake jump in the canoe with me. So I was a youth minister at the time, and we had taken a bunch of high school kids on a canoe trip down the Current River. Anybody been on the Current River? A lot of fun. Flows very fast. It's not as smooth as the Kaskaskia River. Current River probably flows 15, 16 miles an hour. The Kaskaskia flows about 5 or 6 miles an hour. Kind of an interesting river to navigate. But we had taken this group of teens on a canoe trip down the Current River, and I had taught canoeing, so I enjoyed a canoe, but I inherited 2 teenage girls who had never been in a canoe in their life. That was interesting in and of itself. 2 sisters. One was in the front seat. I was in the back, because that's the person who usually provides the steering capability of a canoe that doesn't want to steer very well. And then the sister sat down. There was no seat, but she sat down on the bottom of the boat in the middle. And so I didn't realize at the time that the sister that was sitting in the front, she's kind of a nature lover, kind of an animal lover, cats, dogs, horses, snakes. And we're paddling along, and she sees this brown water snake swimming in the water. She wants to start paddling toward it. I'm trying to paddle away from it. She's trying to paddle toward it. Well, lo and behold, I start really juicing up the power in the back, and we run over the silly thing. Well, then she starts screaming and hollering because we ran over her little brown water snake. I was kind of happy about that, but we ran over the snake, and and I didn't realize that in our paddling in the canoe, we got a little closer to the bank than I would have liked to. And next thing I know, the sister in the very front, she begins to scream and holler and yell. And I figured she's screaming and hollering because I ran over the snake, and I'm back there laughing up a storm because I thought it was funny. She jumps out of the canoe. Where did she go? Well, next thing I know, the sister in the middle, she stands up in the canoe, which you don't do in a canoe, and she's screaming and hollering. The next thing I know, she bails out of the canoe. So I'm left there with the canoe by myself, and about that time, this biggest, darkest snake I'd ever seen in my life made its way back to where I was and rested its head right on my foot. Now, normally the captain goes down with the ship, you're right. Not this captain. He bailed out too. And I began to swim for shore as fast as I could get. Now, the adult sponsors had great delight in knowing that I had done that, because they said I was the only youth minister that they had ever seen that could swim in 2 feet of water. I was making hay to get away from that snake. So we get to talk about chapter 10 in Ecclesiastes. So if you go ahead and turn there and hold that and read it, we're going to read it here in a bit. Then we're going to talk about flies, snakes, and horses. But before we do that, I think it's important. Jeff has done a marvelous job. Ecclesiastes is a very interesting book, depressing by its own rights. But there are some things that you need to know about Solomon's life, some context, if you will, that will help you understand and have some insights as we wade through chapter 10. Chapter 10 is a little difficult because it talks about some things that kind of, get a little, get a little convoluted, and you're thinking, where in the world is he going with this? Now, you have to understand that Solomon suddenly gets proverbial. He kind of has a flashback to when he wrote the Proverbs, and so he starts being proverbial here when he gets in chapter 10, but there are some things about Solomon's life that I want to go through. So what I want to do is accomplish a couple things this morning. First of all, I want to give you some context about where Solomon is in his life and how he kind of got there as we wade through chapter 10. The next thing I want to do, because chapter 10 is kind of a difficult passage to wade through, I want to outline that for you. And you'll notice on the notes, and they're lengthy, but it won't take but a couple minutes to go through that because I'll have the slides. But I want to show you how, when Solomon wrote this, how he grouped some of the verses together. And it starts to make sense when you see some of the clusters of verses and how he wrote certain things and what he was trying to say. And then finally, what I want to do is get to the meat of what I think Solomon was trying to share with us as he penned chapter 10. Anytime we're reading Scripture, it's always important. One of the best ways to understand Scripture, and those of you that have taken the Bible class with Jeff when he teaches you how to study using study tools stuff like that, I'm sure he gets into the fact that so many times it is so vitally important when you're reading through Scripture to understand the author's intended meaning. What was the author trying to say at the moment he said the things that they did? So I want to walk through some of the context and help you understand Solomon's heart. So let's walk back a little bit, back to 1 Kings, when we see David on his deathbed. David's the king, and he's about to pass. And so he calls Solomon, whose son, who is destined to be his successor, to sit on the throne of Israel and become king. And so there he calls Solomon before him, and he wants to give him some advice. So in 1 Kings chapter 2, he outlines for Solomon what he wants him to focus on as he enters his kingship. Now notice the things that he accentuates in his message to Solomon. First of all, he says, I want you to be strong and act like a man. Basically, he knew that Solomon was going to need all the courage he had. The Israelite people weren't the easiest people to rule. Kind of a fickle people. They had a mind of their own a lot of times, and we can see some of the rebellious nature that they had through their history. So they weren't the best people to kind of endure. And besides that, they were surrounded by nations that just really didn't like the Israelites very much and wanted nothing to do with them other than to lead to their destruction. So he knew that Solomon was going to need all the courage he could muster. The second thing he said is observe what the Lord your God requires. He knew that if Solomon was going to be successful, it wasn't going to be about him. It was going to be about his relationship with God. He knew that he was going to need all the strength and all the insight that the Lord could give him. And so he said, Solomon, you need to go there. He said, walk in obedience to him. There was the Mosaic law that Solomon would have been familiar with. And we'll see down the road that Solomon kind of lost sight of that. But he said, Solomon, you need to follow all the ordinances, all the decrees that God has laid out for you. And then he said, keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations. And then notice what he says in the end. He says, do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go. Solomon, you want to be successful? These are the things you need to focus on, because you're about to go where I was in your kingship, and it's difficult, and you need to abide by all these things. Now, here's something that's important for you to know, and this is important to understand the context of where Solomon goes in chapter 10. Solomon was a mere 20 years old when he became king of the most powerful nation, or one of the most powerful nations in the history of the world at that point in time. He was about to inherit a kingship that was going to be difficult at best and challenging to no end, and he was going to do that at 20 years old. Now, there's nothing wrong with being 20. A lot of youthfulness, a lot of strength and vitality. But, let's be honest, the experience is just not there. And he's about to inherit this kingship by himself at 20 years of age. Now, let's compare that. The youngest president that we've ever had in the history of the United States was Theodore Roosevelt, and I believe he was 42-ish at the time he became president. I think the next youngest was JFK, and I think he was 43. So there's a big difference between 42 and 20. And can you imagine a 20-year-old taking over the reins of the presidency of the United States of America with all the difficulties and challenges that we as a people present? So Solomon was 20 years old when he entered being the king of Israel. Now notice that in 1 Kings, when you go back, and I encourage you to read 1 Kings, because it kind of gives some insight, but in 1 Kings chapter 3, we see this discussion that God has with Solomon. Now, this is an important discussion. This is where we get this whole ride about Solomon being the wisest man in the world. So he has this discussion with God, and God does something pretty unique here. He offers Solomon a blank check, if you will. Anybody here would like to be given a blank check? Somebody just give you a check and say, hey, I'm going to sign it. You just fill in the amount. And that's basically what happened. He said, Solomon, I want you to think about this, but I want you to choose. I'm going to give you anything you want. Wow. I can think of a new motorcycle in my future. Kevin, you could probably think of a new plane maybe in your future. Somebody give us a blank check, we could think of all kinds of things. Think of the opportunity that Solomon had here. This wasn't just, this was incredible. Solomon, ask for anything and it's yours. And, I'm sure Solomon gave it some thought. He probably remembered back to the speech that his dad gave him about what he needed to focus on. And so Solomon said, okay, this is what I want. He said, give your servant, now get this is important. He said, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, watch this, and to distinguish between right and wrong. Now, here's what I want you to understand. That word that we get, discerning, is kind of an interesting word. It literally means to listen, to hear. What did Solomon want to hear? What did Solomon want to listen to? It's obvious. God, give me an ability to hear your heart, to listen to your heart, so that when I make my decisions, they're decisions made based on knowing what you would do, how you would handle this. It's literally that WWJD we used to wear on our wrist all the time. What would Jesus do? God, what would you do? Give me an insight into your heart so that when I start making choices, I start making these decisions, I start doing these things at age 20, that I'm listening to your heart and I know. So we understand, we give credit to Solomon being the wisest king ever. Well, he was wise because he chose to listen to God's heart so he would know what was really right and what was really wrong and how to make these choices that would be wise. And so what did God do? Well, we see there that as we continue the text that God grants his request. Not only does God give him what he asked for, he gave him everything he didn't ask for. Solomon, because you chose wisely, I'm not only going to give you wisdom, but I'm going to give you the riches that you didn't ask for. You're going to be wealthy beyond your imagination. And I'm going to give you that power and strength among your other nations. These other nations are going to fear you. I'm going to give you all the stuff. Solomon could have easily said, hey, at 20, I'm not I'm not for having to fight all these people that are around us. So God, if you can just make all of them disappear, that'd be great. He chose wisdom, and because he chose wisdom, because he chose that ability to listen to God's heart, God gave him everything else. Well, when did things go astray? Well, we see later on, as we read through 1 Kings, we get up to chapter 11, this is what it says about Solomon. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. So Solomon, somewhere along the road, left the reservation, so to speak. He just didn't get it. And his life suffered for it. And so we see a lot of that in Ecclesiastes. And when we read 10 today, you're going to see some of the frustration that really comes out in his life, understanding 1 Kings 11 here. And then fast forward to God's response to what Solomon did. Later on in verse 9 it says, and the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. So when we understand the bulk of this context, suddenly the things that he begins to say in Ecclesiastes becomes real and evident. So Kevin, you'll appreciate this story, being a pilot yourself. There was a small plane that was traveling across the country, and there was 4 people on the plane. There was a pilot flying the plane. There was a minister on board, a small boy on board, and a computer programmer on board. Well, lo and behold, the pilot walks back to the cabin compartment where the passengers are and says, well, hate to tell you this, folks, but the plane is going down. And the worst part about it is there's only 3 parachutes, and because I'm the pilot and I have a family who loves me very much, I'm taking one of them, and he grabs up a parachute, and out the door he went. So the computer programmer says, hey, look, I'm the smartest man on the face of the planet, and the world needs me, so I'm taking one of the parachutes, and I'm going. So he grabs one of the parachutes, and out he goes. Well, the minister, being up in years and looking down at the small child, said, look, son, you know, I'm old in years. I've lived my life to its fullest. There's only one parachute left. You go ahead and take the last one, and you're young, and you've got your life ahead of you. And the young man looked up at the preacher and said, hey, pastor, don't worry about it. The smartest man in the world just jumped out of the plane with my backpack. I believe we're going to understand that there's a difference between foolishness and wisdom. And Solomon makes that plain and evident as he goes through chapter 10. I mean, he really, it really gets down with this, and I want you to pay this. So I'm going to read this for you. I want you to follow along, and then after I read it, then I'm going to real quick dash through an outline to show you how the verses are linked together, and they make a little more sense when you see them in that. And then I want to give you the takeaways. What was the author? What was Solomon really? What was his objective in chapter 10? What was he trying to share with you that's going to be helpful and beneficial for us? So here we go. Ecclesiastes chapter 10, back with the flies and snakes and horses. The very first verse. As dead flies give perfume a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Anybody had a fly in their tea? Anybody drink a soda and found a fly? You know, suddenly you had to spit out the soda because you had a fly in it. I got to tell you, a bunch of us were headed down on a trip, and we were headed out of Galveston, and we were driving down through Arkansas. And as we drive, it's several hours down here. Of course, we stop. I get hungry. Everybody gets hungry, and we stop. And so somebody decided, hey, you know, there's this Chinese place. Let's go eat Chinese. Now, I love Chinese. Has nothing to do with my slanty eyes, but I love Chinese. So we stopped at this Chinese place. I couldn't wait. It was a Chinese buffet, which is even better. I mean, it's great, all the Chinese you can eat. And so we walked into this buffet to eat Chinese food, and I couldn't wait to get up there. I could see the buffet line up there, all these dishes up there. I could not wait to get up there, up until I looked just above the the thing that had all the buffet food on it, and hanging from the ceiling just above the food line was about 8 fly traps. You know, the sticky ones that hang down and all these flies attached to it. Suddenly, I lost my appetite. I just, as much as I wanted Chinese food, Mark, it just wasn't there. I just couldn't do it. I don't know why they had all the fly traps there with all the flies hanging on it, but it just didn't, you know, it was kind of interesting. Solomon says one fly. He was talking about this ointment that the weather there is so arid that they had this ointment evidently that you would apply to your skin, kind of like a perfume, but it would help from the drying and cracking of the skin. Well, he said one fly makes that go bad. You must know that from experience. And basically what he was saying was, hey, of all the good things that I did, you know, look at the one thing that propped up that just destroyed my reputation, destroyed everything else I did. One fly is all it takes. He said, dead flies give perfume, a bad smell, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. The heart, he talks about the heart a lot, the heart of the wise inclines to the right, but the heart of the fool to the left. No political undertone here, but back in that culture, the right was considered important, was considered good. Talk about the right side, the right hand, the right of this, the right of that. The left was considered bad. So you wanted to be on the right, not the left. And we'll talk more about how Ecclesiastes verses talks about that on the right and left. Incidentally, this is a freebie. This doesn't cost you a thing. But the Latin word for left is the word sinister. You didn't know that? Yeah, just freebie. I just threw that in. You can take that home. But let's go on. Verse 3. This is kind of fun. Verse 3. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. Wow. Now that's how the NIV puts it. Now the NLT kind of softens down. This is what NLT says about verse 3. You can identify fools by the way they walk down the street. That's a little softer. NIV doesn't hold anything back. They're stupid. You know, that's what fools are. If a ruler's anger rises against you, do not leave your post. Calmness can lay great offenses to rest. Here is an evil I have seen under the sun, the sort of error that arises from a ruler. Fools are put in many high positions, while the rich occupy low ones. Anybody in your positions seen people that got elevated to a higher position than you, and they had no idea what they were doing? You know, we've all been there. You know, we've seen that. Talking about people that just get elevated for whatever reason. We won't even go there. We get elevated for whatever reason and can't figure out what they do. I have seen slaves, verse 7, on horseback, while princes go on foot like slaves. Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Now, the pit he's talking about here is not just an ordinary hole. You're not digging for water or digging like that. The pit he's talking about are the pits that they used to dig back in that culture to catch wild animals. So in other words, that if you're foolish and you do foolish things, the pit you dug to catch the wild animal, because of your foolishness, you may fall into it. That's the kind of pit he's talking about. Whoever digs a pit may fall into it. Whoever breaks through a wall may be bitten by it. You got to bet snakes again. Bitten by a snake. Whoever quarries stone may be injured by them. Whoever splits logs may be endangered by them. If an axe is dull and its edge unsharpened, more strength is needed, but skill will bring success. Back to snakes again, verse 11. If a snake bites before it's charmed, the charmer receives no fee. Words from the mouth of the wise are gracious, but fools are consumed by their own lips. You ever heard somebody that just likes to hear themselves talk? Been around all those type people. At the beginning, their words are folly. At the end, they are wicked madness. And fools multiply words. No one knows what is coming. Who can tell someone else what is happening after them? The toils of fools wearies them. They do not know the way to town. They didn't have GPS. You know, you can tell a fool because they just walk around aimlessly. They don't know what they're doing. Verse 16. Woe to the land whose king was servant, whose princes feast in the morning. Blessed is the land whose king is noble, of noble birth, and whose princes eat at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Verse 18. Through laziness the rafters sag because of idle hands. The house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, wine makes life merry, and money is an answer for everything, so they think. Do not revile the king even in your thoughts, or curse the rich in your bedroom, because a bird in the sky may carry your words, and a bird on the wing may report what you say. Incidentally, the saying that we all have, hey, a little bird told me, this is probably the passage it came from. So when somebody says, hey, this little bird told me that, da-da-da-da-da-da, this is probably how that got started, talking about they'll be careful because a bird may hear what you say in private and take it to somebody else. In other words, don't tell somebody something that you absolutely don't want anybody else to know whatsoever. And how many times have we all been guilty of that? By the way, a little bird told me so. Now, let's quickly, I want to outline these clusters of verses for you to give you a sense of where Solomon is going with this, and then we'll quickly go to the takeaways. What was Solomon trying to accomplish? So here we go. 3 general outward characteristics of fool. This is what Solomon says. These are the characteristics how you can tell a fool. A fool's reputation stinks. Back to the fly in the ointment. You can do all these, accomplish these amazing, and Solomon did. Solomon accomplished and amassed amazing things, but one little piece of folly, his downfall. So he said, all it takes is one. A fool's reputation stinks. A fool's worldview is wrong, left and right. Some of you are familiar with Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis Ministry. I'm not particular a fan. I like some of the things he says, but I don't follow along. But one of the things I do appreciate about him, he's always talking about how we need to look at this world through biblical glasses, put our biblical glasses on, so as we see things, we understand the rightness and wrongness of things through God's eyes, through what the Bible says. We have a better worldview. We just don't look at the world and say, well, that might not be so bad. Or, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is because it defies the morality of God. So we look at things, our worldview is based on looking through things through God's eyes. And then finally he says, a fool's actions reveal foolishness. In other words, you can tell a fool as soon as he leaves his house and walks down the street, some of the things he does and says, and he'll reveal it himself. You'll be able to tell a fool. Then he says 4 specific categories of fools. This is kind of neat to walk through. 4 categories he categorized: foolish leaders, foolish workers, foolish talkers, foolish people in general. You got leaders that get elevated rapidly. They shouldn't have been, and they're foolish because they have no idea what they're doing. You got workers that do things from a foolish perspective. He talks about the different things: the pit, with the axe, the wall that they were breaking through, and they're not taking caution that snakes are going to be in this wall, so they get bit. So you got foolish workers that do foolish things while they work. Foolish talkers, people who just like to hear themselves talk, people who talk foolishly, and you can just tell the more they talk, the more foolhardy they sound. And then foolish people in general. And then he says, and this is important, 4 specific characteristics of fools. A fool is indulgent. They're more concerned about the things they can absorb and take part in than the right things to do. A fool is incompetent, have no idea what they're doing. They're just doing it because they got stuck there and they have no idea and they don't know how to reach out for help. Incompetent. Fool is indifferent, doesn't care about anything else but themselves. Whatever I can do to make myself look good, to amass what I want, I'm good. And a fool is indiscreet. Here again, the little bird told me so. This guy is the one that wants to brag or talk or spread gossip or whatever. And the more he talks, the more foolhardy he sounds. Those are the characteristics. 3 outward general characteristics, 4 specific categories, 4 specific characteristics of fools. Now, in all of this, what in the world, in his proverbial talking, what was Solomon really trying to say? When you look at his context, when you look at 20 years of age, he becomes king of the most powerful nation in history. Amasses all these riches, all these things that he accomplished. My goodness, the man had 700 wives, 300 concubines. He had 1,000 women in his life. Men, I don't know about you, but when I get a honey-do list for my wife, it's long and distinguished and takes me a while to get through. Can you imagine a honey-do list times 700? Wow. I mean, Solomon had all these things. What was he trying to say? With all he had amassed, all he had accomplished, all he had done, what was he trying to say when he wrote Ecclesiastes 10? Three things. First of all, Solomon began worshiping the gift instead of the giver. Solomon started worshiping the gift. All these things that God had given him, he started worshiping that instead of worshiping God who gave the gifts. So often we get that way. So often we are so excited about what we did and what we accomplished and what we can do, and look at everything that I've done, everywhere I've gone, all the things that I can do. Look at my talents and resources and riches, and look at all this. And we leave God out of the picture, and the next thing we know, we're in Solomon's shoes. We're in decline. Why? Because we began worshiping the gift that God gave us more than God. We left God out of the picture. And Solomon found that out in a horrible way. No wonder so often did he use, all the way through Ecclesiastes, everything is vanity, everything is meaningless, everything is nothing works. Why nothing worked? Well, gee, Solomon, how did that work for you? You know, oh yeah, you're the wisest and smartest and richest man in the world, but you left God out of the picture, and how did that work for you? Solomon learned quickly that his problem was began worshiping the gift more than the giver. Secondly, life is weary and disappointing without God in it. Solomon lost his sense of direction, his sense of purpose, his sense of meaning, lost it all. He really became the fool that he categorized here in chapter 10. All these things that he said, all these categories, all these incidentals about being foolhardy, he was talking about himself. He said, look, I realized, I came to the realization that I took God out of the picture, and look what happened to my life. Life is weary and disappointing without God in it. And finally, and maybe most importantly, nothing can replace the love and blessings we receive from knowing and serving the Lord. Solomon amassed all these things to try to eliminate God out of the picture. Had wealth. Let's eliminate God. I don't need God. Look at all I've got. But everything he accomplished, everything he amassed, meant nothing when it was all said and done. Because there was no purpose, there was no strive, there was nothing to live for, nothing happened. Okay, I've got all this money, now what? I've got all these women in my life, now what? I've got all these accomplishments that I didn't, now what? There was no purpose, there was no meaning, there was nothing left. And he realized very quickly that in your attempt to do everything that you do because you want to do it and you can do it, and you leave God out of the picture, life becomes very dismal very quickly. And so Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes 10 as a lesson, as a warning to all of us that God has to be the picture. When God gave Solomon a choice, I'll give you whatever, choose. And Solomon says, I want a listening heart. That's where we ought to be. God, I want to know your heart so I know what to do in every instance. Give me your eyes. I want to hear you. I want to know what you're about so that my life is more complete and I can make the decisions in life that you would make. It really is WWJD. What would Jesus do? When we discern our decision making after God's heart instead of ours, that can be deceitful. Worship team, I'll have you guys come on up. I'm going to close this out. I want to share something with you. This was kind of fun. Last night, the Empty Nesters had an amazing time. 106, 108 of us in here had some incredible food. It's pretty neat when we here at Copper Creek have our own professional chef to cook for us. And April just outdid herself. I mean, the food was just, I can't even describe how scrumptious the food was last night. And the entertainment, we just had some amazing times. And you know, I know, you know, some of you guys are trying to, you know, sell your kids off so you can join the empty nesters. But we had a great time. But we had 3 guests last night. We had Brando, which some of you know from the morning show, 106.5, was here talking and was quite the celebrity. He was kind of interesting to listen to. We had a guy by the name of Bruce Veach. He was a stand-up comic, and he was good. He had a lot of interesting things to say. We had a lot of good one-liners, Mark. He was really good. And then we had this guy, and this was kind of impressive. We had this guy who was an actual contestant on the show Survivor. How many of you watched that? How many watched Survivor? So this was Survivor Fiji, and his name was Nick Sifu. It's a kind of a funny name, but I think I pronounced it right. And he's a martial arts master. I mean, he was quite the guy. I mean, wasn't very tall, which I was kind of impressed with. Kind of made me feel good. Wasn't very tall, but boy, was he bulky. And so Jeff was interviewing him up here. Jeff was I was impressed with Jeff. Jeff was kind of the Brian Gumble kind of interviewer, interviewing this guy and talking about his experience on survival. I was all ears. I was anxious to hear. And so one of the questions that Jeff asked him was, what was the most challenging? What was the most challenging experience you had on Survivor? Now, I expected him, I really did, I expected him to say, wow, you know, the physical agility, here I am, a martial arts expert, but boy, some of the physical stuff we had to go through was just, you know, I expected that. Or the foraging for food, because they had to forage for their own food. They had to come up with their own food. They had to make their own fire. They had to do a lot of incredible things. And I really expected him to go there. That was your biggest challenge, you know, the physical agility that you had to, and the strength and energy that you had to. But this was pretty incredible. Rich, you'll like this. This is what he said. He said one of his biggest challenges on Survivor was homesickness. He was homesick. He said, I had a fiance that was back waiting on me. I had a dog that was back in town. He said, one of the first things I did when I got back from Survivor was go to Five Guys and eat a burger. Hadn't had a burger. And so he said, I was homesick, terribly homesick. And it was a struggle for me. And I thought about that, and I thought, wow. How many of us get homesick? And I'm not talking about this home. I'm talking about our eternal home. How many of us get to the point in our lives where we can't wait to stand face to face with our God and to be in His divine and eternal presence and enjoy that moment? How many of us just long for that? And the reason why we long for that is because we're living that now. So actually meeting God is going to be nothing strange because we've known Him all along. That's the conclusion that Solomon came to. Hey, look, I did it all, and I was good at it. I accomplished it all, and I was good at it. But the one thing was missing is it was all about me, and I left God completely out of it. And you just can't do that. So I want to invite you this morning to examine your life and see where it's going. Maybe you find yourself in Solomon's shoes, and you're thinking, you know, my life just really is not there. And maybe you need to reevaluate as Solomon did and said, hey, you know, I put God back in the picture. Things are going to be better. Maybe you need to get Jesus in your life and get things right. Maybe you need to come to that conclusion that I need Him in my life. I want to accept Him as Lord and Savior of my life. I realize what He did on the cross for me and my sins. And I want to confess Him as Lord and Savior and be buried in Christian baptism and have that assurance of salvation in His love. Or maybe you just need a church home. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can rekindle that love for God and worship with the rest of us that are all trying to do the same thing, is to enjoy that moment with our Heavenly Father. Whatever your decision is, we invite you to come forward and make it this morning as we stand and sing together.